If you've watched one of my new videos this year, you know that 2023 means a new army. And why not? After all, I wants it. In the previous video, I put together and painted all these really cool looking Grey Knights. Some of them were Terminators, some of them were teleporty guys, but they're all really pretty cool. But the box came with one more thing, and that's this big Stompy boy. And you probably know by now that I do love me some Stompy robots, but I don't like me some fixed weapon emplacements. So, what's a guy gotta do? Magnets, that's what. So my big batch of parts is beginning to resemble the model it's supposed to be. This is as far as I've gotten, and it's been a decent process so far. Although I don't think I did this right. Look at the Space Marine's torso and his legs. They seem to be a little discombobulated. And now things are falling off. Okay, before I mess it up too much, I wanted to explain that this is about where you want to be when you start having to make decisions about magnetizing your walkie boy. And you have some options. Roughly speaking, you're able to swap out the weaponry that the mech is holding in its hands. So either like a big power sword or a big power hammer, or your choice of 3 different ranged weapons, one of which looks to be a flamer, the other one's probably a psych cannon, or psych cannon, I forget how that's pronounced, and there's what looks like a bigger version of the assault cannon, basically a minigun with a number of different barrels that spin up and shoot hot lead down the field. So it sounds easy enough, but the devil, as always, is in the details, and here the details are kind of unfavorable. Which means that we're going to have to make some compromises. Yeah, there's nothing stopping us from fully magnetizing this kit. I mean, it's possible. Except that you probably wouldn't like the process, and then you'd have a bunch of pieces that you have to store somewhere. And, you know, not lose ever. But the biggest problem with that technique of completely magnetizing everything about the weapons faithfully is that you don't get much value out of it. Here's what I mean. Let's talk about the 3 ranged weapons. We've got that guy, the flamer variant, that guy, the sight cannon variant, and that guy, the just a bunch of lead variant. And you'll notice that there's a core body, a core central piece that all 3 variants share, but you don't get 3 of those pieces. You only get 2 of those pieces, which means that you can either keep one the same and then just magnetize one, which is, you know, it's an option. But look at what makes the different weapons different. You've got the 3 essentially barrels that make the weapons different, but you also have kind of a piece in the back, a decorative element or a functional element if this was an actual, you know, gun. So to fully magnetize this, you have to magnetize both the barrels and those decorative elements in the back. And while it's not impossible, it's a lot more work than you're probably prepared to do. It's certainly a lot more work than I'm prepared to do. It's gonna look a little funky. I don't know. I just don't see the value in it. Instead, what I'm going to do, and what I recommend that you do, is magnetize the front, the barrels, swap them out all you want, but keep the backs, that decorative / functional element, that, you know, the ammo storage or whatever you want to call that, keep that the same. You're going to have 2 different varieties. You know, pick 2, glue those on, stick to them, and then just magnetize the fronts. It's going to look a little weird. So for example, here it's going to look a little weird. You have a flamer with its tanks, but if we don't choose the tanks, this will be the flamer and there's no tanks here. But what's to say the fuel tanks aren't just stuck inside there and they left this piece on there for, you know, modularity, whatever. It's a toy you're going to have pretend space battle with. It's fine. Just glue the backs, swap out the fronts, it'll be fine. As for the hand-to-hand weapons, well, that's pretty straightforward. You magnetize both the thunder hammer. It has a fist that already molded to the plastic, so you insert a magnet at the back of the fist. You insert a matching magnet at the front of the arm, and you do the same thing with the big old power sword. Thankfully, the power sword has its own fist. You don't have to worry about choosing one or the other. You can always magnetize both and attach it to the same arm. The only tricky bit there is that very same arm has to also potentially carry a ranged weapon. In this case, it's not going to be so bad because you're magnetizing in different spots. So the hand-to-hand weapon goes here at the wrist, magnetize here. The ranged weapon goes here at the forearm. So we magnetize both, and we have all the options that we need to give our weird stompy boy as much tactical flexibility as he could possibly need. So first things first, let's get the ranged weapons magnetized. And I'm going to start off by kind of explaining what my approach is going to be. So we have 2 weapon bodies and 3 weapon variants, which means that we can modify both weapon bodies to accept all 3 weapons variants, or we can seek out a little bit of efficiency. And let's face it, I'm all about efficiency, lazy. So my approach is going to be to take this weapon. This is, I believe, like a giant sight cannon. We're going to leave that as is. So this weapon with this ammo container and this barrel, yeah, that's it. That's done. I'm not going to magnetize this at all, because that means that I now only have to magnetize this weapon body and these 2 weapon barrels. There's a couple of ways that we can accomplish this. I'm going to accomplish this with the technique that seems to work for me fairly regularly, and that is so we're going to cut off this peg, and we're going to drill a hole into this weapon body where I can mount a magnet. And on the barrels, I'm going to fill this in, or maybe actually no, maybe I won't need to fill this in. Maybe I can just add a magnet here, because neither one of these are particularly big and heavy, so any magnet size really will do. So I can put a magnet in here, cover it with some putty, and assuming that the polarities are correct, they'll just be able to snap into place, and we should be good to go. So let's start by defacing our weapons, starting right now. Now, before deciding on what drill bit I'm going to use to make the final or final-ish hole, I have to decide what size magnet I want to use. And there's a number of considerations at play when you want to decide what kind of magnet to use. The most important thing is the size of the components you are magnetizing. In this case, we have this weapon body and we have this barrel. These aren't very big. As a matter of fact, this is going to be holding up this barrel. There's not a lot here, so we can probably get away with using a small magnet. I typically recommend using the biggest magnet that you can fit in the space, but in this case, the weight of these barrels is fairly insignificant, so a magnet of almost any size is going to do the job. For me, I think I'm going to go with this guy. It's a 2mm by 2mm. It's a kind of a cylinder, kind of a rod-shaped magnet. They look like this. And since it's a 2mm wide magnet, all I need now is a 2mm wide drill bit to sink into this, or really to widen up the pilot hole. And since my drill bits aren't really labeled, I can't tell how wide, what the diameter is for my drill bits, so I confirm that it's the right size by taking my stack of magnets, adding this drill bit to the side, and yeah, it's the right size. A drilling we will go, a drilling we will go. Oh, there's the split. That's okay, squeeze it together, try to get the job done anyway, and then reglue after that's done. A little dollop of super glue into the hole. We take our second magnets and put just one in there. We don't need to add any more than that. Now we'll use ceramic tip tweezers to make sure that the magnet is nice and flush with the surface of the weapon body. That should do the trick. I use a ceramic pair of tweezers because I don't want the magnet to be attach itself to the tweezers as I'm pushing stuff in there. Alright, let's let it dry, and that should be this half of the weapon. For the weapon barrels, there's a couple of ways I could go, but you'll notice that the backside of both of these already have a hole, which means that the magnet should be flush with the bottom of that slot there, of that hole, as opposed to flush with the surface of the barrel here. So our magnet wants to be in there, except that we've clipped off the tab, remember? So now we actually do want to be up flush to the surface. And so the best way to go about this, at least in my opinion, is to fill that hole in with a little bit of Tamiya epoxy putty. It doesn't have to be Tamiya, it just has to be some kind of epoxy putty. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a two-part putty, as long as it's malleable to begin with and it solidifies relatively hard. Yeah, my personal favorite is the Tamiya epoxy putty. I have used green stuff before and I have found it kind of gritty and kind of gross to work with, but you know, I have used it in the past. I will probably use it again in the future. And of course I have a preference. We have Tamiya epoxy putty quick type and smooth type. I prefer the smooth type. It feels smoother to me. It's a little easier to work with, but it could all just be in my head. Who knows? All I do know is that I'm almost out of this Tamiya stuff, so I need to reorder. As I was mixing up my epoxy putty here, I realized that I hadn't checked the depth of that hole. So I don't know for a fact that, well, I didn't know for a fact that the 2mm by 2mm was going to work. It's going to work in terms of diameter, but in terms of depth, I don't know. And I tested it out, and it is just a little bit too tall, which means I need to use something that is less than 2mm in height. And I hate using 1mm magnets in any dimension. They're just too small, and they typically don't do any kind of a job. No matter how strong the magnet is, it just doesn't seem to get the job done. But it's either that or drill a hole into an existing hole, and ain't nobody got time for that. So let's fill this in with the epoxy putty. Make sure that we get it nice and flush with the surface. Keep in mind that this doesn't have to be beautiful because this is on the part of the barrel that nobody is going to see. I mean, you want to do a decent job because you'll know it's there. So, do a job that you would be happy with. And once you've got the putty in there, you want to add the magnet. You want to push it in from your stack. And you want to push it in, not central in that hole, but kind of towards the top. These weapon barrels are offset in a weird way, so you want to remain faithful to that. I'm going to let these magnets set in place, and so when this is done, this barrel should magnetize to this weapon body pretty well, but I don't want to mess with that just yet. I'm going to let things dry, probably at least overnight. And if overnight seems like a long drying time, this is just so I don't have to mess with adding the magnet back in. I'm probably still going to have to go and glue things down because epoxy putty, it is really more of a fill things in, not an adhesive kind of a thing. So I want to make sure that the epoxy putty sets really well before I introduce any super glue to the mix. Really, my only concern with this approach is that to get this weapon fixture onto the arm, you need to move this power conduit, you kind of have to stretch it out just a little bit to get it to go in places, you see. And so I'm just concerned that this will, so this will be painted before too long. And I don't know that painted plastic likes to be moved around much. So I'm concerned that just this amount of bending is going to flake off the paint on this tubing. I don't know how true that is. I've never really had to deal with that, but we'll see. If prolonged moving does have this impact, then I may need to magnetize this component. And if I do that, what I would probably do is remove this power conduit to fill in this hole right here and magnetize this component there, just to minimize the complexity of any kind of magnetization project. This conduit, it doesn't need to be there. The power running from one part of the arm to the other, from inside to the outside, it's pretty superfluous, I think. I figure engineers would know how to move this power conduit from this side to that side, so all you have to do is mount it on the arm, and then you would have all the adaptability that you need. But we'll see how that works out over time. Let's start on the hand-to-hand weapons, and for that we need the hand. Okay, so that's not really the hand, that is more of an arm, but the hand is right here. And so the hand can go right in here. You see there's that tab, and there's a peg on the hand, and I'd like to swap that hand with this big ol' hammer, or this even bigger sword. So to accomplish this, it's basically the same idea as that last step, where we're preparing the weapon's body and the barrel swappable things. Basically, we're going to fill in that hole with putty. We're going to put a magnet in here, and then each of these three hand options are going to cut off the tab and drill a hole, sink a magnet in there. And once that's all done, it should be good to go. The only problem here is that I should be able to use any size magnet for the hand, so I'm not concerned about that. But these two are considerably bigger, and by bigger, I mean heavier, which means that there's going to be a lot of stress on this magnet. So I need it to be as big and beefy as it could possibly be. Otherwise, our model is going to be holding the hammer like this, and it's going to droop, or it's going to fall off altogether, and nobody wants a big hulking robot that can't hold a sword. I mean, what else are they there for, right? So because of the heft of these weapons, I need to go back to my biggest possible magnet that'll fit, and that's these guys, a 4mm by 2mm magnet. Again, it's a cylinder, and it does the exact job that I need. It is just the right size. In fact, if that was a circle as opposed to a hexagon, then I wouldn't even have to do anything else. But as it stands, I do have to glue it, and I don't know if there's enough contact points in there, so I may have to fill it in. Oh, I don't know. Let's try it with just the glue, shall we? Gonna get a little bit of glue, make sure it hits the sides, because that side is where it'll be sticking. When you're done, it should look like this, and it looks like it's going to be enough contact points to hold. It wants to stay there. We'll see if in the long term it requires a different approach, but for now it looks like just the super glue will work. Which means we can prepare the hands to receive their magnets, and that involves snipping off all the tabs. Houston, we have a problem. My approach to magnetizing the arm didn't work. Turns out this is a little bit more complicated than I expected, which means we either have to rework this whole thing or introduce yet another compromise. And this one, I'm afraid, is going to be a step too far for most of you. So what I'm talking about is the way this arm connects to the mech, and it connects through this thing right here, which I thought was just a weird design issue, but it was fine. Now I just absolutely hate it, because when you attach the arm to the mech, there's this other piece that glues on here and attaches to the arm there. That by itself isn't a problem. However, this is the same piece, it's the same connector that you need for the weapon. So this connects to the weapon through this peg and that hole. But you've only got the one piece, and it's glued up here and it's glued down here. So I can either glue it to the gun or I can glue it to the arm, but I cannot glue it to both. That's quite simply not how glue works. So what to do? Well, option one is to attach the gun to the arm on a permanent basis. So the arm can look like this at all times. We could still switch the hand-to-hand weapon, or just say there is no hand-to-hand weapon, it's just going to be the arm. In that way, I can now add, oh, not there, it goes there. Now I can add the barrel attachment, either this flamer. Oh no, this doesn't work either. Oh boy. Okay, so I need to fix this, but you can do that. But if it has the hand-to-hand weapon, this gun has to stay on. And I don't like that approach. The other option is to just say, you know what? The right arm will always have either the Thunderhammer or this sword, and it will never have a gun. Now, this is probably a decent compromise, because if you have a Dreadnought, you want it to have a hand-to-hand weapon. You don't want a shooting platform. That's what tanks are for, or other things. It's a little less satisfying, but it might be the way to go. And I think that's what I need to do. However, that means this gun that I thought was permanent, well, it's less permanent, because I didn't assemble this with magnetization in mind. I glued this together, so I need to replace this weapon with this guy and magnetize the barrel of the sight cannon so that it could go onto this, so it will always have a ranged weapon of your choice. I think that's the way I'm going to go. So you've seen all the steps, so I'm not going to bother you with them again. I just have to do the rework. Yay! Bam! There he is. And he looks not bad, not bad. I mean, overall, it's a goofy looking model. I'm really not a fan of this style of Dreadnought, but you know what? It's fine. He looks just fine. And you really can't tell that we chopped him up to bits and drilled a bunch of holes in him, and that is kind of the point. You want the tactical flexibility without too many visually jarring compromises. And after doing a little bit of extra work to make sure that everything works the way it should, I can take this big old sword, replace it with this big old Thunderhammer, or for some reason I want just a fist, no melee weapon. we can still do it, but you want both your weapons. You want a melee weapon and you want a ranged weapon. And there's that guy. It looks like it's the assault cannon or whatever variant they call it. It's a multi-barreled slug projector. But you can swap this out really easily with the sight cannon or the cleansing purity of fire. Or if for some reason you really want to channel some anime, now you've got a double punch gun. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Everyone needs a double punch gun. And you know what? Once I paint this guy, that's how I'm going to display it. Why? Because I can. Now I won't pretend I didn't do more compromises than I wanted to magnetize this model in an easy way. I mean, I could have gone all out, but nobody really has time for that. This hobby is hard enough without making your life even that much harder. I mean, you're going to take a hand-to-hand weapon and you're going to take a ranged weapon. What more do you need? Keep one arm dedicated to the melee weapon, keep another arm dedicated to the ranged weapon, or the double fist, as the case may be, and you're going to be just fine. And you've saved hours of trials and tribulations to get the magnetization just right. At the end of the day, I feel like this model is hampered quite a bit in terms of the magnetization and posability because of its design. This thing here and all the connecting doodads that you have to worry about just to get the arm in place. This is probably one of the worst models in terms of magnetization that I've built probably so far. It's like Games Workshop went out of its way to make sure that you had to buy multiple versions of this model. I mean, that evil plot required a lot more forethought than probably happened. The reality is they probably just went with the rule of cool, which really should guide most of our decisions in this hobby space anyway, and the result is that you get a model that's kind of goofy looking. Some people love it, and it's a little harder to magnetize than it probably should be, but at the end of the day, you still get a big, stompy robot with a variety of weapons with which to deal the ouchies. And that's all she wrote for this project. It was short, sweet, and simple. Even if filled with a few more compromises than I expected in the beginning, that's alright. The project is done. You, yes you, have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.